Hello and welcome to Rauta's opinion videos. Today I'm gonna do one of the videos which is a sort of a requested video based on what you have suggested me on both our Discord server as well as on the comment section and whatnot. And this is about starter package for extreme metal. I got this kind of a request that what I would include if I had to create sort of a bands list and other ideas for a person, fictional or otherwise, who would be in the starter, extreme metal, and what would he or she need to know, which bands to pick up, or maybe albums, and for what reasons. Now, this is of course a really huge topic. I could drop a big list of names of an albums, which should be there or should not be, and of course this is always a matter of opinion as well. Now, because I didn't want to do, say, a list of like must hear 100 an albums or whatever releases, I just tried to focus on the more essential stuff, kind of a be all end of all kind of list from which one can expand and explore further, genres further, local scenes, and later more important releases. But get the idea from where one should basically start, and go from to whatever directions. This is something that I'm gonna suggest. I know already, as a disclaimer, I'm gonna just say this before I gonna start talking more about this, that I know some of you will totally disagree. Some of you will just totally thumb me down, which is totally fine, by the way. But remember, these are just my ideas. And of course, I'm gonna just forget something. I'm gonna ignore something. And maybe there are some things I just didn't, think of in the first place to be very meaningful, because extreme metal is such a huge field. It's really hard to create this kind of a end-all be-all list that will just be suited for everybody. Now remember that I'm gonna do this list based on newbie information, or what is considered for list for newbies, rather than, it's not like I'm gonna tell veterans what bands they should include there, because that would obviously make no sense at all. So, extreme metal. First we need to kind of decide what we will include in extreme metal. Usually people mean death metal, black metal. Well, I would also consider thrash metal, but would I consider doom metal? Well, not so much. And of course we can pretty much figure out that heavy metal, power metal, that kind of stuff, melodic metal, whatever you want to include, they are not in the sense of any extreme. We could also debate even if thrash metal should fit there, but as you will find out when I'm gonna mention the names, it should become more or less kind of should make sense to you why I'm including thrash metal here. So before we start, more than that, I should also remind you that it's impossible to list every country, so this is not like one band per country which are more important, because let's face it, some scenes were more important with certain genres than others. Some countries didn't have plays at all when certain genres or subgenres were created, or when they flourished or became big. And of course, some countries are just bigger than the rest, and that is why this is so much focused on some places more than the others, and so forth. So, where should we start? What is actually the birthplace of extreme metal? Now, that is, for me, impossible to say, basically, because even the originators of metal itself is up for debate. Some say just simply Black Sabbath, and to me that's kind of a fine. I don't actually disagree with that, even though I'm not a Black Sabbath fan, but that's a totally different thing. Some say it was born with Steppenwolf, with the song that actually mentions heavy metal, Born to Be Wild and all that stuff. But extreme metal is a different breed, obviously, because when Black Sabbath created their stuff, it's kind of a proto doom, proto heavy metal at the same time, and from that became the other genres. But one band I think is one of those bands that probably should be mentioned before any others, and that is Venom from the United Kingdom. Now, Venom's material is not very extreme if we take it to this day and compare it to so many other bands going more extreme. But that is, of course, what we call evolution. You know, things get the idea, people get ideas of things, and then these things are taken more extreme, taken to the next level, so to speak. And so things evolve. But back in the days, Venom was as bad and as raw and as primitive and all that satanic as things were. So Venom would be kind of a starting point. But there's no reason to, to listen to the whole Venom discography when we're talking about starter package. We could just, pick like black metal and go with it. So, where next the thing is, now we have to think that like which genres are more like older than the rest, which had more impact and so forth. Now, some consider black metal to be way younger than death metal and thrash metal, and in some ways it's kind of a true, considering that black metal kind of started very slow, but it kept, took the speed, kind of all, and kept going and going and going and going more extreme, maybe other genres. But then again, the originators of black metal, besides Venom 2, are old as hell. And we could say that right after Venom, we need to mention that Celtic Frost would be in the starter package, especially the really, really early material. We could also say Hellhammer, but I'll try to stick to the kind of album material bands. So Celtic Frost and the debut album should make to the list, in my opinion. It has affected so many more maybe meaningful bands and albums later on. And Bathory, of course, from Sweden. Now, without Bathory, there probably wouldn't be bands like Burzum and the rest. And, well, lots of bands have taken their material and ideas from where Bathory started. But Celtic Frost, Venom are really, really important in this context as well. Now, since we're talking about early 80s, it's worth mentioning that at the same time, basically, in the United States of America and Germany especially, there were like two zines. Well, we could debate how many there were actually, but, American Big Four thrash metal is something that not only created or made a lot of sense in the creation of thrash metal, but because it also impacted a lot of black metal and death metal bands. So I would say definitely the big four of American thrash metal. That is Slayer, Metallica, Megadeth, and Anthrax are worth mentioning. Well, Anthrax never been that much an extreme band, but they started early on, and they were on the lighter side of thrash metal, but they had a huge impact how this whole genre would be defined. Megadeth never been extreme, very extreme, and same goes for Metallica. I mean, Kill 'Em All, really extreme in a way, considering that it was like very early 80s. But still, these four big names had such an impact in the whole genre. And now you must remember, even their own music might not be very extreme. Even bands such as Cannibal Corpse have covered Metallica later on and mentioned that these bands have played a big part of what they become. I mean, kids from the 80s and 70s, how they grew up with these bands. Slayer, of course, one could say, of course, is most meaningful with their satanic lyrics and, with their, these arm pieces with studs and spikes and nails and whatnot. So they would have to be mentioned, because without thrash metal, one could say, would there be death metal in the first place? So all these happened in the early 80s. Now, death metal didn't take that much more time to come from, after thrash metal. And of course, it was more extreme. So if we should mention death metal, we should, figure out which of the bands were, more important than the others. Which one would be part of the start package? Well, I would say definitely Death and the debut album. I mean, it's not the best album by Death, but it came so early on. Possessed should be definitely mentioned because it's one of those trash death hybrids and one of the originators of death metal, pretty much the same vein as Venom is to black metal. That should be included. And of course, bands like Cannibal Corpse, D-Side, Morbid Angel, which all played a big part of what death metal, not only American death metal, mind you, would become. Obituary and, bands like that. And also, when it comes to thrash metal, before I forget, obviously we have to mention the German trio, Sodom, Destruction, and Creator. They all played also their big part of what the thrash metal in the European style would be. But now at the same time, different places, different bands were, becoming a thing. Sarcophago into Latin America as well as Sepultura, from Brazil, they had their impact. Then again, Napalm Death, Carcass, Ball Thrower, they were early on creating their material in United Kingdom. Then there were like more random bands like Terrorizer from United States and the Swedish death metal scene with Dismember, Entombed, Grave, all that stuff. As well as, Finnish scene had their like prominent names with black and death metal like Beherit, Archgoat, Impel Nazarene obviously, Baratrum maybe needs to be mentioned. All these bands were kind of like creating this whole mass, which wasn't so uh, easy to see how things were like. For example, the recent Archgoat interview, which we did late August and got released a couple of weeks ago. For example, the guy from Archgoat actually said that when they were started creating like late 80s their material, this wasn't so defined how black metal was, how death metal was. And bands like Blasphemy and Archgoat and lots of others um, started, picking just elements from, different things. So they might sound more like death metal bands, which Blasphemy and Archgoat too many years do, but they also had these kind of a satanic ideas, lyrics and whatnot, which then again were more on the black metal side. But back then, late 80s, there weren't bands like, Emperor, Mayhem, Marduk, they're all bands of the, 90s. I mean, Mayhem had something going on already, of course, but it wasn't, a thing. It wasn't a household thing in like actually until the early 90s. Not to mention bands like Immortal and, Arcanum and all the other stuff. I mean, there are lots of great bands, but I wouldn't include all of them in the extreme metal starter pack because, after all, consider this: you might have a brain capacity at first for like 10 or 20 bands or albums, from which you would start to create this kind of a experience or trip a path to the extreme metal. And if you would have to pick like one album per band, it still would, fill rather quickly. So like, for example, if I were to kind of create this, I wouldn't say listen to Napalm Death discography or Morbid Angel or, Slayer, but rather pick some random albums from here and there, like debut album from this band and maybe second album from this band, and from that create this stuff. But it's still really hard. Of course, I would drop off bands like Anthrax. They are not that essential in extreme metal. I could drop off, the whole Swedish death metal scene. You could pretty much live without it when you're, creating this kind of a start package. But to kind of understand how diverse the whole extreme metal scene, if there is any in the first place, it's so many countries, so many people, and so varied ideas that it's really hard to, like just pick five. Because after all, who is there to decide whether Sodom or Slayer is more important to extreme metal? Are they, not any of them, neither of them, important in the sense of, if we are to find the core of extreme metal. And then again, if we listen to like Venom's black metal nowadays, like I said, it doesn't really feel that extreme. If you are like born in the 90s or even millennial person, and you have heard or already bands such as like Origin and Archspire, Venom found sound very extreme. If you're already gone through Ildiarn's whole discography, most bands won't sound very raw to you because you've already been on the raw side. And the list is really, really hard to be created in such a manner that it would be pleasing to everybody. So when creating a starter package, I would rather say you need to know these bands and these albums in order to understand what became later on. For example, rather than recommending Burzum right away, I would say go to Bathory. You might even not like it, or you should probably if you're into black metal or extreme metal. But without Burzum, without Bathory, you wouldn't probably have Burzum. You wouldn't have Darkthrone's best black metal albums without Celtic Frost. You probably wouldn't have the whole United States of America's death metal prominent names without Possessed and things like that. So it's basically really, really hard to just list like 5 or 10 most meaningful names. Even 20 or 50, goddammit, might be hard to say. So I don't know if this video actually helps you that much, because like I said, oh, by the way, lights are getting darker. I mean, it's just, so hard to create such a list that would be something that is already there, laying for you all the necessary bands. But I hope this gives you a little bit insight of what was going on prior to decades of these current bands and the names that we now live by when we talk about black metal, death metal, thrash metal, or just extreme metal. I mean, Behemoth is now a big name. Dimmu Borgir is big name. But would they be anything without the bands that came already in the 80s? I don't think so. So, here's my 2 cents, my too boring 17 minutes or so. Do with anything with this information you need to do. Should you disagree, have questions for me or whatever, just leave them on the comment box below. And if you think this was a waste of time, please mention that as well. There are plenty of more better content for you on YouTube. So let's get going. Let's listen to some good metal shit and all that stuff. Bye bye.